process. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Cody H. I serve as Director of Education and Interpretation here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. See a lot of familiar names. I think a couple of first-time names here as well. So if this is your first time joining us, certainly welcome. If it's not, welcome back. This is our last History Happy Hour of the 2024-2025 season. This is an excellent way throughout the cooler months of the year, especially. We're able to stay engaged with members and supporters and visitors from all over the country, as well as, especially in a case like this evening, speakers from all over the country as well. I think that all of our speakers throughout the course of the past 7 months have been each from a different state, which is the first time I think that's happened, and is a nice distinction and a way of showing us just how much we are able to engage with so many people all over the place when we are engaging in events like this. The first thing I want to do before we jump into introducing our speaker this evening, I'm going to share my screen and have a couple of housekeeping with regard to a couple of events we have coming up. It's a really busy time of year with regard to events, with school groups. We've had school groups here just about every day this week, and we'll be going through that over the next several weeks here as we wind down on the academic year. Our speaker this evening, Keith Harris, is bringing a group in a couple of weeks, so it's an excellent, exciting time of year to engage with young people. The other way that we are engaging with our community every other month, with the image you can see on your screen there, is our nonfiction book club. That's held the third Tuesday of every other month at 1 o'clock here in Schmucker House, the offices of Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center on the historic United Lutheran Seminary campus. And our next book is going to be next Tuesday. We're stepping out of the Civil War world for the first time in quite a while. We're going to focus on Napoleon's Buttons, which is a combination of history and chemistry, looking at how 17 molecules have changed history throughout the course of humanity. That'll be next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. And then our next one will be June 17th, one of my favorite books personally, Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard, focusing on the assassination of James Garfield and its aftermath. So that's going to be April 15th and June 17th. There are our next couple. Next Friday, at just about this time here on Seminary Ridge, we'll be partnering with our friends at the Gettysburg Foundation for an event that is one piece of many that's taking place across the country, Two Lights for Tomorrow, in honor of the 250th anniversary of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and William Dawes. And we are going to honor that occasion with a series of speakers throughout the course of an hour and a half and a ceremonial candle lighting, taking 2 lanterns to the cupola of the Lutheran Seminary, representing Old North Church in Boston. This is going to be the kickoff event for PA America 250 in Adams County. This will be the very first event taking place during this statewide, and here countywide in this case, commemoration of something that of course will take place over the entire country over the next several years as we commemorate the 250th anniversary of the birth of the United States. So you can join us at 7 o'clock next Friday, just right in front of the museum, right in front of Schmucker Hall at 111 Seminary Ridge. It's totally free, and we look forward to welcoming our friends from the Gettysburg Foundation and welcoming anyone who will attend. The following weekend after that, on Saturday, April 26th, we're working with American Battlefield Trust, and we're having Park Day. This is an event taking place all over the country. Our contribution will be from 10 to 2, from the morning to the afternoon of Saturday, April 26th. You can see the contact information there on screen. You can just send me an email if you are interested in helping us. We're going to be straightening up, clearing up some weeds, brush, and the rail barricade on the western side of the ridge, scrubbing the brick patio in front of the museum, washing wayside markers and benches, raking and filling in gravel along our historic trailway. And so we have a variety of things. If you're interested in participating, you can sign up, as I said, by emailing me there at ceash@seminaryridge.org. Our next Friday is on the Ridge. We're taking a break for a couple of weeks with other events that we have happening. We'll be at 3:30 on Friday, April 25th. Caleb Kazmierczyk, our Director of Museum Operations, will be continuing his popular Treated at the Seminary series, where he takes a 1-hour deep dive into the biography, background, wounding, and treatment of one of the 493 identified individuals who was treated at the seminary hospital. In this case, he's going to be looking at Sergeant Adam Heilman, who was the color bearer of the 151st Pennsylvania, the last regiment to fall back from Seminary Ridge the first day of the battle. That's a free program with museum admission or membership. It's going to be in our Lydia Ziegler Clare Education Center on the first floor of the museum. And lastly, as I mentioned at the top, this is our final history happy hour already. I can't believe it's already been 7 of these since last October. This is our last one of the 2024-2025 season, which means that next month we will begin our popular sunset walking tours that we hold every summer. Our first one's going to be on May 23rd, as tradition, on Memorial Day weekend. We're going to start with the final attack, July 1st, 1863. And we always like to have a little bit of a twist to it. And this time around, we're in the middle of a big artifact rotation right now. So we're going to be focusing on some stories of artifacts that are going into the museum exhibits that pertain to the story that we tell of the battle on the western side of the ridge. You can see the other dates there, June 20th, July 25th, and our exact date in August is to be determined, but keep an eye out very shortly. Next week, we should have that nailed down. These all start at 6:30. They all meet at the Martin Luther statue right next to Seminary Ridge Museum. We look forward to welcoming our friends back onto campus for our outdoor programming as we start that up again next month. Now, without further ado, let us move on to our main topic this evening, which is welcoming Dr. Keith Harris. Keith is a historian, a high school history teacher, an author, a Star Wars fan, and a cat person. He received his BA at the University of California at Los Angeles, earning summa cum laude, and his PhD in United States history at the University of Virginia. He has taught courses in U.S. history at the University of Virginia and the University of California at Riverside, and currently teaches at a private high school in Los Angeles. His work focuses on 19th and 20th century American history, with a special emphasis on the Civil War, Reconstruction, historical memory, the Progressive Era, and national reconciliation. His first book, Across the Bloody Chasm, The Culture of Commemoration Among Civil War Veterans, is available from the Louisiana State University Press. I say this not just because he's here, but because it's true. This is a really high-level go-to resource for me. It was released at a formative time in kind of forging my interest in historical memory and in veterans commemorations. And it's a wonderful narrative, incredibly well written, and contains a variety of amazing resources. It's a great book to footnote mine as well. And I've always appreciated Keith's work in general, and especially in that book. He's currently writing a book on the topic that he's talking with us about this evening, the concept of American exceptionalism and monuments at Gettysburg. He lives and works in Hollywood, California, where he's joining us from this evening. Please join me in welcoming Keith Harris.
Wow, that was quite an introduction, Cody. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And it looks to me like you guys have got a lot going on these next few weeks. And I'm kind of jealous. Sometimes I live on the West Coast that I can't get out there for all these things. And I'm only out your way, once a year at best, really. But I'm looking forward to bringing my students, which I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes. I'm looking forward to bringing my students to the Lutheran Seminary in a few weeks. Where we'll tour the grounds and check out all the cool stuff that is to be checked out there on the ridge. So thanks again. Like I was saying, every year I take my high school students on a field trip to the Gettysburg battlefield, and we explore the area around Gettysburg, and we go to Harper's Ferry, and we go to Antietam sometimes, and we go to Richmond occasionally, and we go all over the place. And I'm getting ready. I'm in my final preparation mode for taking 23 high school juniors across the country to visit. And that's actually kind of a difficult thing to do logistically, and also kind of, corralling 23 high school juniors can be something of a chore. The hardest thing that I found over the years is to keep them out of the road, which is kind of a funny thing. You take city kids across the country and you think that they're going to be aware of their surroundings, but they're not. I guess they're on vacation and they tend to wander off into highways. So that's one of the most difficult things that I have to deal with. But one of the things that I have them do, one of the easier things I guess I have them do to start with anyway, and they find it more challenging as the story progresses along, is we have something of a monument project when we're on the battlefield. Now, as you all know, I'm sure there's monuments galore on the Gettysburg battlefield. There's 1,300 approximately monuments and markers all across the Gettysburg battlefield, most of them to units or states of the United States Army, various states, their national monuments. Now, there are a handful of Confederate monuments, as you know, but most of the monuments deal in some way or another with the United States, units there. And over the years that I've been traveling to Gettysburg, going back several decades by this point, is that I've discovered that the monuments don't really say all that much on them physically, beyond the occasional nod to bravery or fortitude. And if you're lucky, the monument might say something on there about the preservation of the Union, which of course was extraordinarily important to Union veterans. You might, if you look closely at some of them, get a sense that Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg in the summer of 1863, was the turning point of the war. The Confederate on the ascendancy up to Pennsylvania, and that marks the high water mark. In fact, there's a monument there called the High Water Mark Monument, the high water mark of the Confederacy. And as the story tends to go, the Confederate Army is on a downward trajectory towards Appomattox from that point forward. That seems to be something that you might find by looking at the monuments as well. And there's supportive evidence for that. Newspapers in the summer of 1863, in the wake of the battle, were reporting that the Confederates are on the run. We've got them now. It's only a matter of time before the Union is victorious, and that seemed to be the sentiment in the summer of 1863. Now, that sentiment is very short-lived, as you know. By the summer of 1864 in the United States, the sentiment has changed a great deal, and a low point in United States morale. The morale in the United States was at its very low point, I believe, in the summer of 1864, while Grant is chewing through the Overland campaign, and those and the casualties are coming in astronomical numbers they're not playing well for the United States war effort. Veterans, I think, veterans' recollections, especially in their regimental histories and in veterans' publications, all seem to suggest also that Gettysburg is somehow the turning point of the war. And of course, as you know, John Batchelder, the famous historian who was the first to write a history of Gettysburg and wrote about Gettysburg in his travel guides and various other things, used veteran testimony. And in his veteran testimony, he notes that Gettysburg was the turning point of the war also. But that's really about it. I think when you look at the monuments in person. And what I task my students with is to try to figure out what the commemorative landscape at Gettysburg is all about. And it's a nice little project for them, and they have a lot of fun with it, because what we wind up doing is to go beyond what the monuments actually say. One of the people that I'm going to read you in a second refers to monuments as silent sentinels, and I think that that's in many ways true. I think that but you can get so much more out of these if you look beyond the monuments themselves and look at the dedication speeches. And I think the dedication speeches tell us a lot more about what the commemorative landscape was all about in the wake of the Civil War in the 1880s, early 20th century. Now, on one hand, the speeches reinforce the turning point idea over and over. Turning points to save the Union, especially. I'm gonna read to you a handful of quotes, and I just want to point out right out of the gate that the quotes that I'm using tonight are representative of a significant number of veteran testimony that suggests the same sentiment over and over and over again. So I'm going to read you representative quotes that stand in for a number. But here's Henry Slocum, the commander of the 12th Corps at Gettysburg after the war, at a monument dedication ceremony, said this: "Upon no battle ever fought were such great results depending. It was the turning point in our Civil War. It was a contest, the history of which is better known than is that of any other great battle," suggesting that there it is, supporting the turning point theory. Other veterans tend to look at the Battle of Gettysburg as a turning point to end slavery. Now, that's an interesting idea, because really the idea about slavery, emancipation, the issues that were at stake in the war are pretty much missing from the physical monuments themselves. I have yet to find anything that explicitly says anything about slavery, emancipation, abolition, anything like that at all on the physical monuments. And that might lead some people to believe that it wasn't really important to veterans. But what I've discovered is, if looking at the speeches, it becomes very clear that a number of veterans found the end of slavery to be important. I'm going to dissect that a little bit more in a second. But for starters, I want to read to you a quote from a veteran of the 13th New Jersey. That monument, if you're on the battlefield, I believe, is just at the base of Culp's Hill. So if you go to Culp's Hill, you'll see the monument it's kind of a modest monument in comparison. But here's what he had to say at the monument dedication in I want to say 1888, if my memory serves correctly. He says this monument shall stand among the many which are to be erected here as a silent sentinel to indicate to future generations where soldiers of bravery and renown gave up their lives in defense of their country, to show where are the graves of the true patriots who dared die for the hopes of man and the redemption of a race from slavery. But, and I will go on, it turns out that the monuments on the battlefield aren't just commemorations to turning points, whether turning points to save the Union are turning points to the end of slavery, or some combination of both of those things. They are commemorations of American exceptionalism. And this is what I'm framing my current work on. I've recently published sort of a warning shot in Gettysburg magazine that lays out my sort of preliminary ideas on all of this, and I'm beginning to dissect it more over the summer, talking about just how important the concept of American exceptionalism is when it comes to monument commemoration and when it comes to the garden variety 19th, early 20th century Civil War veteran. The trick is, of course, is these days, the idea of exceptionalism is a little sticky. And a lot of people get anxious when they hear the expression American exceptionalism. I think it's a lot of people think it's associated with some sort of jingoistic hyper-nationalism or over-the-top American hubris. Some people even think racism is at work when people talk about American exceptionalism. And maybe in some ways that may be true depending on who's talking about American exceptionalism, of course. But what I think tends to get lost if somebody denunciations of the exceptionalist idea is that 19th century Americans were really committed to it. All kinds of people really were committed to this idea of American exceptionalism, and people ranging from ordinary Union soldiers, enlisted men who joined veterans groups, who attended monument dedications, who would go on for the rest of their lives talking about these things and regimental histories and various other things. Everybody from ordinary Union soldiers to Abraham Lincoln himself embraced the idea of American exceptionalism enthusiastically. So I think it's important before we start talking about monuments dedicated to the principles of American exceptionalism is to define what 19th century Americans really thought American exceptionalism was. And over my reading and research, I've discovered that it consists primarily of 3 points, and this dates all the way back to the 1780s. But these are ideas that are embraced by 19th century Americans and very much forwarded among Union veterans on the Gettysburg battlefield. Number one, the first key point, I think, is that the founders of the United States created a unique nation in the context of Western civilizations in the 18th century and then extending into the 19th century. And these things were based on individual liberty. This nation was based on individual liberty and equality before the law. There are no hereditary aristocracies in the United States. There is no monarchy in the United States. And at least in principle, there is a robust meritocracy in the United States. In other words, it doesn't make any difference who your father was. You are on your own to make your way. And with hard work, you can achieve that success in the United States. That's an idea in the founding. Number two, because of these unique qualities, the United States is better than any other country in a context of Western civilization. In that regard, it served as a beacon for the rest of the world. Lincoln once called it when he addressed Congress just on the eve of the Emancipation Proclamation in December of 1862. Lincoln addressed Congress and referred to the United States as the last best hope of Earth. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Number three is that the nation was guided by divine providence. Okay, now this one is extraordinarily important, I think, to 18th and 19th century Americans. It's something that may have gotten lost in our more secular approach to American exceptionalism now, is that 19th century Americans really thought that God had a hand in what was going on, including the victory, Union victory in Civil War. It was messianic in the sense that God willed the nation, willed that the nation was destined to redeem the world. Think in terms of 19th century manifest destiny, the belief that the United States had a role in spreading liberty and democracy that was at the very foundation of the nation. Now, of course, all of this stuff is in principle. My students, in the classroom and when we're on the battlefield, they're always very quick to point out that these ideas sound very nice, but in practice, they didn't always extend to everyone in the United States. And of course, that's absolutely true. Without question, that these ideas were limited to a smaller portion of people who lived in the United States at the time. But I like to remind them that Lincoln himself would suggest in the Gettysburg Address that the nation was indeed a work in progress, and that the war was a test, and these are Lincoln's words, whether or not the ideas would endure. Okay, so the point of all of this stuff is that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the monuments were dedicated, when most of them went up on the battlefield, some of the principles that are embedded in the founding of the nation, some of those principles had yet to be realized. But the ideas themselves still mattered a great deal to Union veterans. And in regard to the unique and superior qualities, I can give you just one quote. And again, this stands in for quote after quote after quote after quote that sound very much just like this. This is a Union soldier, and he's got the best name of any Union soldier I've ever encountered. His name is Chill Hazard, which is a fantastic name. But here's Chill on the ideas about on ideas and the battlefield at Gettysburg. He says at a monument commemoration, looking around, I suspect, at all the various other monuments that were present at the time, he says these stones mean that there is to be no government on this soil with taxation without representation. They mean that our forefathers brought forth on this continent a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And there he is, invoking the Gettysburg Address, of course. And then he goes on to praise the United States as a beacon to those around the world, from every land and every clime, he says, who are seeking to embrace liberty and escape oppression. Now, that might seem strange to people who are studying the 18th and 19th century, when we have the institution of race-based chattel slavery, we have Jim Crow segregation, we have all those kinds of things, and oppression is a fact of life for millions of Americans, and that is absolutely true. But the idea that somebody would make that statement at a monument dedication suggests that he's committed to the principle, and the principle is what's important. And so going forward, this is what he's shooting for. The key to understanding this is that so many veterans, and I'll reiterate, this quote stands in for many, so many Union veterans underscored basic liberty rooted in the founding and suggested that applied to everyone, especially a race liberated from bondage as a result of the war. And I've got a couple here that I think you might find pretty interesting. General William Hobson, for example, this is a dedication of the 17th Maine Monument, said this about the incompatibility of liberty and slavery, understanding very well that, of course, liberty and slavery coexisted under the national flag for a very long time until 1865, but that is no longer a thing, and that there was definitely an irreconcilable conflict. And here it is, for example, he said, the failure of the republics of Greece and Rome, invoking antiquity here, the failure of the republics of Greece and Rome was owing to the fact that they did not recognize the vital principles of democracy, the equality of all people before the law. They undertook to reconcile liberty and slavery under the same form of government, much as the United States had once tried to do, which was a mistake that must always prove fatal to democracy, he said. It was the same mistake which came so near proving fatal to our form of government and which culminated in the War of the Rebellion. In essence, what he's saying is that the Confederacy existed to reconcile liberty and slavery, and that was the point of secession. And he says that these two things are, of course, irreconcilable. Dan Sickles, who I'm sure you all know, one of my favorite characters from Civil War history and post-Civil War history when it comes to the commemorative efforts of Union veterans. Dan Sickles, the former commander of the Third Corps who lost his leg at Gettysburg and went on to do all kinds of scandalous, fun things to talk about. Dan Sickles said this on the battlefield in 1891, long after the battle, the flag, so long without meaning. Strange way of putting it, but there he goes. The flag so long without meaning, all at once had a new charm. We counted its stars, it stood for union. For the rich, it meant their wealth. For the poor, who have only a country and a home, it meant everything they held dear. For the slave, it meant freedom. Hmm. And there you go. This is there's Dan Sickles saying something very typical, something like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain would say when he dedicated his monument on Little Round Top to the 20th Maine. We all know Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He's a very prominent figure. And by the way, just a little side note, I haven't been to Gettysburg with my students since Little Round Top reopened for visitors. So I'm looking very much forward to visiting the Chamberlain spot, the 20th Maine spot where Chamberlain gave this address, which I'm going to have my students read at the very spot. It's a very moving speech, by the way, if you read the whole thing. And here he says at the dedication, he said, "It should be distinctly borne in mind that we are not antagonizing the principle of local self-government. Our triumph was for all the people, and in full recognition of the value in our political system of recognizing local centers of influence and of government." And he goes on to say this, which I think is very interesting indeed. "The lost cause," we all know what that is, "the lost cause is not lost liberty and right of self-government. What is lost is slavery of men." So the question then, if we're thinking about American exceptionalism, and all 3 points of American exceptionalism, is where does God factor in to the commemorative ethos there? Well, importantly, I think that veterans would argue all along that all of this, Union victory, everything going forward, was owing to the guiding hand of God's will. At the same dedication where Chamberlain gave his address, another officer from the regiment said this, listen carefully: "Union victory meant the final and complete triumph of the Army of the Potomac. After 4 years of severe struggle, mixed often with bitter defeat, it meant the vindication and reestablishment of the government, the end of slavery, honor instead of shame, and prosperity and peace instead of peril and disaster. All of this," he said, "signaled the decree of the Almighty." And another example says something quite similar. A Michigan veteran, an enlisted man, said this is his monument dedication in 1889. "Our comrades died for the noblest cause that ever marshaled men for war, a cause that they felt to be eternally right and holy. And after a quarter of a century, the whole civilized world has affirmed their verdict." Okay. So let's take a pause right there and think about this for a second. With all of this stuff in mind, the exceptionalist nods, and I come across these things every time I pick up a monument dedication speech, whether those are held in private collections, which they often are, whether they're housed at the Library of Congress, whether they're held at Gettysburg Archives, whether they're held in special collections departments around the country that I've been to many and many and many of, or whether they're searchable online in Google Books, wherever that is. They tend to lean back on these American exceptionalist ideas constantly. American exceptionalist ideas that tie the saving of Union with the end of slavery. And so the question that I have is, with all of that stuff in mind, we have kind of a different spin on reconciliation. The nation reconciling after the war and putting their past war differences aside. I think you'll find that to be a common theme at monument dedications and at veterans gatherings, this idea that, now that the war is over and distance has come between the actual fight and the current event, that time has erased the differences between former enemies, and then they can shake hands across the bloody chasm. There's the title of my book. Thanks, Cody, for that. They can shake hands across the bloody chasm in friendship and put the past behind them and march forward together under the same flag as united Americans. We see this theme come up in 1898, for example, when Union and Confederate veterans meet together and send their sons off to fight under the same flag against the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. And continuing on to the 20th century, that is a common theme. But those of you who are familiar with the work of David Blight, who is a magnificent historian and a scholar at Yale, his book, Race and Reunion, which I think is one of the best books really on reconciliation, because it's so beautifully written and there's so many fantastic observations in the book, except that I think that he's wrong about something that's pretty important. One of his primary theses in the book is that The reconciliationist movement came at the expense of the emancipationist vision of Union victory. In other words, what he says is that veterans who were leaning into reconciliation as much as they could put race and the issue of slavery aside and then remembered the war as a war for Union alone. Now, to Blight, what this suggests is that white supremacists in the 19th and 20th century, rather, is that white supremacists and reconciliationists could march together arm in arm and remember a war, commemorate the memory of that war on Confederate terms, whitewashing the history of the war and writing slavery, emancipation, and abolition out of both the cause and the consequences of the war. That's Blight's assertion. It was extraordinarily influential for a number of other scholars. This came out early in the 21st century, 2001, I think is when the book came out. And it continues to be very influential today. My book, Across the Bloody Chasm, challenges some of those arguments, as do a number of other people. Carrie Janey's book about reunion does that as well. Barbara Gannon's book about Black veterans and white veterans commemorating the war together does that as well. And there's been a few other people that have challenged his ideas, but the ideas are still, I mean, it's a great book too, so don't get me wrong about that. The evidence that I found when I was researching this, it strongly suggests that exceptionalists in the Union Army recognize the meaning of liberty, and this is important. They recognize the meaning of liberty as it applied to everyone, not just white Americans, but all Americans, and they used this idea to commemorate victory on their own very sectional terms. And so what I discovered is that Union veterans were perfectly fine and perfectly willing to embrace reconciliation, provided that the other side, in this case, provided that the former Confederates admitted that they were wrong and that and also admitted that they had fought a war to sustain the institution of slavery, and admitted that Union victory ushered in a new period of freedom. And of course, Confederate veterans were never open to discussing that. And so there you go. This idea of reconciliation becomes tenuous at best in that. Okay, so anyway, Union veterans use this idea, maybe in a sense of moralizing self-righteousness. This is what Thomas Presley wrote back in the 1950s, is that Union veterans embraced this idea because it made them feel good about themselves, and it allowed them the opportunity to kind of look down at their former enemies to say that they had done something righteous and you did everything to prevent that righteous act. But just to support my claims, I mean, listen to this Pennsylvania's dedication address for the second Pennsylvania Cavalry Monument at the Gettysburg battlefield. He says this: "There are men in our line who fully realize that the grandest spectacle of all human history is transpiring immediately under our eye. Men conscious at that moment that they are witnessing a contest upon the issue of which depends the fate of the Union and the future of free government in the Western world." And even Woodrow Wilson. Now, look, I mean, we know about Woodrow Wilson. We know that when Woodrow Wilson wrote his own history of the United States when he was at Princeton as a scholar, he almost apologizes for the Klan. He institutes segregation in Washington D.C. when he becomes president of the United States, segregating government buildings in Washington. And so, you know, these are some of the darker chapters, I suppose, of presidential history that he did those types of things. Of course, he screened The Birth of a Nation, if you're familiar with that film at the White House, which is very problematic in terms of its racist sensibilities. But even Woodrow Wilson, when he gave some dedicatory remarks at the 1913 Blue Gray reunion at Gettysburg, he had this to say, and this is very important, despite his usual benign comments he made, you know, talking about things like fortitude and bravery, and that he was very happy that everybody had gathered together, former enemies under one flag. These are usually benign remarks at the 1913 Blue Gray reunion. But then he goes on to a section that isn't frequently quoted by scholars. And let me read this part to you. It says, "I've been chosen the leader of this nation. Whom do I command? The host is the people themselves, the great and small, without class or difference of kind or race or origin. What we strive for is their freedom, their right to lift themselves from day to day and behold the things they have hoped for. And for those who are to come after them, it must be done by plan and with an eye to some great destiny. Here is a nation God has builded by our hands, what shall we do with it going forward? Looking at the monument dedication to the state of New York in 1893, the Reverend Henry Potter said something very similar, and once again invoked God and the future of the nation, suggesting that what the United States Army had done at Gettysburg is tantamount to supporting liberty and equality going forward. He says this at the invocation of the New York State Monument on the Gettysburg battlefield. He says, my countrymen, it was not this man or that man that saved our republic in its hour of supreme peril. These were their steadfast loyalty. These were their cheerful sacrifices. And these, most of all, with their simple faith in God and the triumph of his right. It was they who saved us. Never cease to honor them, and let us see to it that neither we nor they shall ever cease to trust in that overreaching providence that all along has led them. And we, the sons of freedom, and when the sons of freedom, now unborn, shall gather here to sing the praises of these unknown martyrs for the flag, may they kneel down beside these graves and swear anew allegiance to their God, their country, and the right. It's a great invocation. Often my students, when they get to the battlefield and they look around and they see the vastness of the battlefield, when we get in depth about the numbers, the casualties of dead, wounded, missing, captured. When I have them walk around, each one of my students, by the way, gets a little card. On that card, it's almost like about the size of a baseball trading card, really. On that card is a picture of a Union soldier. And on the back of that card is some biographical information, as much as I could find, where they're from, what they did in civilian life, what their families were like, if they had any interests. I have people who liked puppies, who worried about money, all these kinds of ordinary things, humanizing these faces that are on the fronts of the cards. And then we go to where those soldiers actually fought, and we walk in their footsteps, where their regiments were engaged in battle. And then at the end of the day, we gather together and we read what happened to them. We learn about what happened to them. Some of them make it, some of them don't. Some of them are wounded. Some of them are killed horribly. Some of them go on to live very, very productive lives. But the idea is that, my students get to associate a face with something that might be seemingly abstract when you look at maps, when you read textbooks that talk about things that are so distant. And what they often are troubled with, are puzzled by, really, is why on earth would men fight and possibly sacrifice their lives for these abstract ideas like freedom and union? Why would an Illinois farm boy put his life aside and go off to do some of these things? It escapes them. It's very puzzling for them, I think. And I think the reason for this, and we've talked about this in great detail, but I think the reason for this is because today, I believe that, especially my students and students, that people of that generation, I think that they take a lot of these things, freedom and union, for granted. And of course, the point is that we discussed is that Union men of the 19th century did not take these things for granted. They saw their country and they saw their identities associated with their country in peril, because many of them, especially in the United States, saw that the preservation of the institution of slavery, the idea that the Union could be compromised, it could be the disunion could actually be a thing. They saw their country and they saw their identities associated with these things in peril, and they risked everything to save it. And so when you think about it like that, it actually makes a great deal of sense. But they had so much at stake. When secession happened, they had so much at stake when it came to ensuring, if they were committed to the ideals of American exceptionalism, that they did so much to ensure that those ideals continued forward. And I would also like to remind them, and anybody listening really, that the exceptionalist commemorative experience on the Gettysburg battlefield, while patriotic, isn't just, flag waving whoop-de-doo. It's not just that. It's much more to it than that, really. As one Union veteran made clear in July 1888, he said this. He said, "The whole world was benefited by the victory we helped win here. We know that we helped to decide, let us hope for all time to come, that a nation dedicated to the principle that all men are free should live and grow and spread throughout all the world its benign influence and encouraging experiences." And after looking at monuments and then reading the dedication speeches, I think that my students then, at that point, better understand how committed loyal Americans were to what they perceived as their national trajectory, all of which was rooted in what I like to refer to as an exceptionalist creed. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the formal part of this. I wanted to just to show you a few books that I think are really important to the story. Where I get a lot of my stuff is this beautiful volume here. It's very old, and it was once owned, and I quite like this. It was once owned. I bought this at a gift shop. If you can see that, it was once owned by a Union veteran, the senior vice commander of the Department of Pennsylvania of the Grand Army of the Republic, a guy named Francis Hoy. I just got his signature in here, dated 1915. And then this got the provenance is here listed. It was presented to a guy named Ackerman from Pennsylvania, who attended the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1938. So this provenance is actually, I just dropped a bunch of pictures out of it. This provenance is really quite cool, but this is filled with monument dedication speeches, various correspondence between veterans who were in charge of putting the 1913 Blue-Gray Reunion together. So I get a lot of stuff from that book. It's very fragile, and I have to be careful with it. This, of course, is the book that I mentioned by David Blight. This is Race and Reunion. This is a very important book to read for anybody who's interested in the reconciliatory thesis that he puts together, which I think is great. And there's these two books. These are the two books right now that are influencing my thinking, I think, more than anything else. One of them is called The Contest of Civilizations. It's by Andrew Lang. And what he calls the Civil War is a crisis in American exceptionalism. Now, I focus tonight on the Union vision of American exceptionalism, but Confederates had a vision of American exceptionalism too. And they would continue to commemorate their version of the war and their understanding of American exceptionalism after the war. And theirs included the institution of slavery. So from a Confederate point of view, liberty and slavery can coexist simultaneously. And when that became, when those two things that either liberty could or could not coexist with slavery in the United States came to a head and reached an impasse really in the 1850s, I believe that's when I hesitate to use the word inevitable because I don't like that word very much, but it became increasingly likely. And I guess Henry Sear would call it irrepressible conflict, but it became increasingly likely to me that something would happen. Maybe not disunion, maybe not civil war, but something fairly significant was going to happen to rectify that irreconcilable position. And the other book I wanted to briefly mention, which has been very influential in my thinking these days, is called The Armies of Deliverance by Elizabeth Varron. And this is a really great sort of, the subtitle is A New History of the Civil War. And, subtitles like that, I'm always kind of like, I'm a little skeptical when somebody puts the new history. Okay, what's your angle here, right? But this book is really great because of what it talks about, especially when it comes to United States armies. She talks about Confederate armies too, but I really use it for United States armies. They looked at the Civil War as a means to redeem the nation from the sins of slavery, in much the same way that Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, referred to the war as punishment for the sin of slavery in many ways, and that Union victory really was a chance to redeem the nation from that sin. And so those three books, I think, are if you don't have them, you should immediately, after this, go to Amazon.com and get them because all three of them are quite excellent. So I think that actually kind of wraps things up. If anybody has any questions, and right on time too, it's almost as if I planned this out, Cody.
Yeah, perfect time.
The timing is like absolutely perfect. When you teach high school, I think what you learn to do is to get everything that you need to say in exactly the right amount of time. And so I've got a zillion lessons in my bank covering everything from ninth grade world history to an advanced college level historiography course. I've got zillions of these classes that all fit perfectly in 55 minutes. And so I'm good at timing. So I managed to get this one down in 45, which I thought was pretty good. So I'm happy. And I see somebody named Jeff Davis in the audience. That's rad.
There is, yes. Yeah, that's come up before in our history happy hours. Yeah,
your Confederate credentials are in order. Great.
Yes, absolutely. First question that we have is Robert sent me a question. He asked, which issue of Gettysburg Magazine? You had mentioned early on a piece that you had submitted to Gettysburg Magazine.
You would ask me that, wouldn't you? It just came out. I just got it recently, so I'm thinking, is it the fall one?
That'd be fall of
Um,
24. I'm on
I'm
the editorial board, so I should know, but I can't remember
Yeah, you know
offhand.
what?
Yeah.
I actually let me see here. Hold on. Let me pull up something real quick, and then I'll just tell you. I should be able to find that fairly easily. Hold on here.
It was issue 71, which
Okay,
is summer
there you go.
2024.
Summer 24. Okay, I thought it was fall.
Yeah.
Summer it is then. Okay. So yeah, and that's a good. I like that publication quite a bit. And I was very pleased that they agreed to publish it. And it had started off as a little bit academic, and I sort of I cleaned it up to make it more accessible to the general public, which I tend to like. Sometimes I don't think academics write particularly well for the general public, and so I want to make sure that these things are accessible, because I my favorite thing in the world to do is to have conversations and debates with everybody out here. So many people out there are so well read and so informed on the Civil War, probably way more than I am when it comes to stuff, and I love talking to them about this. So I sort of reframed it like that. So I hope if you read it, I hope you enjoy the piece.
Absolutely. So Judy, our executive director here at Seminary Ridge, she says, question, the phrase American exceptionalism is frequently associated with the idea of the American frontier and the thesis by Frederick Jackson Turner, which
Mm-hmm.
says that the frontier experience is the reason for American exceptionalism.
Mm-hmm.
Does this frontier version of American exceptionalism factor into the commemoration at all? Does the closing of the frontier in 1890 impact the decline of feelings of American exceptionalism, as Turner suggests, which is happening at the same time as many of these monument dedications?
Okay, that is an absolutely fantastic question, and thanks. It's Judy. Thank you, Judy, for that question. There's a lot of stuff going on in it, so I'll see if I can unpack it a little bit. So the Frederick Jackson Turner thesis, suggesting that the frontier is closed in 1890 by the 1890 census, and that the United States had always, one of the things that the United States always had going for it, which made it exceptional in comparison to European nations, is that it always had that next hill that you could go over and settle. When things got sticky in the East, when things were difficult in the East, when urban congestion, whatever it happened to be, there was always opportunity on the frontier. You could go out there, you could homestead, you could make your claim, you could do whatever you were going to do, and then you could work hard and you could prosper, which worked in accordance with what I was talking about, American exceptionalism, this idea of meritocracy. It didn't matter if you were an immigrant or if your father was a poor farmer. It made no difference at all. You could go out and you could prosper. And this is something that had been continually going forward since the very beginning of European settlement. The English settlements in Virginia, for example, immediately began this sort of movement west, ever forever west. And this became and the manifest destiny that's associated with that, this constant move west and this sort of call it a divine will for the Americans to move west and take with it the virtues of the Republic, individual liberty and equality before the law. Take those virtues with the American flag inexorably west to the West Coast. Well, by 1890, that's a done deal, and all of the American territories that are now in the contiguous United States are spoken for, and there is no more frontier. And so when these monuments are being dedicated in the 1890s, something new is happening. And what's happened is the United States has adopted something of an imperialist policy, not the same as European nations in the race for Africa, for example, but similar in a way that the frontier is extended into the Orient in a cultural way, in a consumer way, and that this is, in a way, when the United States began to take islands in the Pacific, for example, in the wake of the Spanish-American War, Guam and the Philippines, and in places like that, that rationalizes and justifies, I believe, the taking of those places because they're using the same kind of exceptionalist language, the same idea that we are bringing to, and you'll excuse me for using the language, but bringing to savages around the world, bringing them the virtues of the Republic, civilization. Reading and writing, God, bringing them all of these things, and this is a rationalization for a nation that had historically been anti-colonial, having had the experience of being colonies and oppressed colonies themselves, at least from their perspective. And so they kind of need to rationalize this. So at the same time that these monuments are going up all around Gettysburg in the 1890s and the early 20th century, the same idea is percolating to the surface as well. That maybe it's time for the United States to expand beyond its contiguous borders and move out or into the Pacific, into the Caribbean, and take with it the virtues, take along with those virtues, American virtues. But thanks, that's a great question. I hope I answered all the parts.
Judy, for context, is a historian of the American West. It's a perfect combination of topics for her.
For real, I mean, I live in the West. I love that. That stuff is great. They'd have to come out to the Gene Autry Museum, which has all kinds of cool stuff on Western history.
Awesome. Emily just has a comment. She says, "Great, thought-provoking presentation. Thank you." And
Thank you, Emily.
Robert, likewise, thank you for an exceptional lecture. He says, and then he says, "Could you kindly thumbnail a view of Southern exceptionalism?"
Okay, and I like your play on words there, Robert. Thank you. So there's a very good book called, let me think of it really quickly, by Adrian Brettel. And the title of the book escapes me right now, and I'm sorry about that, Adrian, if you ever hear this. But Adrian Brettel writes this book. It's about what the Confederates envisioned for their future. Assuming that they would win the war, that they would secure independence, and they would be a slave-holding republic. Man, I can't remember that book. It's going to drive me crazy. Anyway, that they were going to establish a slave-holding republic, and then what they were going to do in the future. And when he and I talked about this, I said, this is Confederate exceptionalism. This is their version of American exceptionalism. And what they envisioned was that, their understanding of what the founders put in place, this idea of individual liberty, was 100% valid, but only for certain people, meaning that only for white Americans. And that concept existed for them, and that slavery, and this goes back to Edmund Morgan's thesis in American Slavery, American Freedom. He goes back, that's it, colossal ambitions. Thank you. I feel so much better now. but the idea that slavery in a sort of a strange way to us anyway, sort of underwrote the whole idea of white American liberty, meaning that by virtue of not being black, you are not enslaved, you are free by virtue of your whiteness. And it's an interesting thesis. But I think the Confederates really embraced this idea. They understood a racial hierarchy. And in their understanding of that racial hierarchy, of course, they were, black people were meant by God to be in the position that they were. And I think you'll see a number of high-ranking Confederates that would write those kinds of things. Even the ones that would sometimes be troubled about slavery would say something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing a number of people here. I think even Robert E. Lee said something along these lines at some point, that slavery had its issues. It was problematic to a degree, but that God willed it that way. It seemed apparent that was the way that it was supposed to be. And this is what underwrote their sense of their own liberty. And I believe that when they saw their vision going forward as an independent nation, they thought about expanding this in the same way that the United States would be expanding their understanding of American exceptionalism and their understanding of the virtues of the Republic outside of their borders. And so the Confederates foresaw, where they could spread this idea of a slave-holding republic all around beyond the border, maybe even into Central and South America and into the Caribbean.
Emily says, "Shout out Dr. Harris from Redlands, California by Riverside."
All right. My old stomping grounds.
And then she asks this. She says, "Are you able to write articles quoting these dedication speeches on American exceptionalism, which emphasize that the Union victory was about keeping the Union together and freeing the slaves, to honor and remember what the war was about in light of the government deleting online resources to the USCT, Harriet Tubman, etc.? Hearing the words of these Union veterans really underscores the true history and puts in its place the restoring by omission faux history, rather." So, touching, of course, on modern events and how historical time periods are being interpreted in different ways or lack thereof.
Well, I mean, and I entirely understand that position, which is it's a troubling position to be in, I think, right now. But what I will say about that is, so these resources are located in a number of places and are readily available elsewhere. It makes them less easy to get in situations where they're being deleted because, or they're being kind of shunted aside because they don't support a particular vision of United States history. But I'll say this, and I say this to my students all the time. And by the way, I teach a very diverse, politically diverse student body. I've got students that occupy the right and the left and all spots along the political spectrum, and we have wonderful conversations. And remarkably, we all get along great. So I believe that it's possible for people who have differing political opinions to get along. But I'll say this much, is that I don't think that there is room, or there is a place in the classroom anyway, for ideological orthodoxy. I don't believe that my responsibilities as a teacher is not to promote an agenda, whatever that agenda is. I believe my responsibilities as a teacher and also as an historian is to analyze the evidence honestly as I can, and to come to conclusions with an effort as much as I can to distance myself from my own personal politics. And of course, I know that that is impossible completely. I don't think that it's possible for anybody to be completely objective. We've all grown up with our racial, our ethnic, our religious, our regional, our political backgrounds, and those are going to color our views of how we read things and interpret things all the time. But I do think that is worth aspiring to objectivity, and I think that will get us the most honest reading of the historical evidence. And so that's what I push anybody, whether they're in the classroom, whether they're historians, whether they're sitting on, they're sitting on a committee in Congress deciding what the official narrative, if such a thing actually exists, of the United States is going to be. And I think that that's really important, that we embrace with both hands and all of our hearts critical thinking.
Well said. Well said.
Thank you.
Any other questions anybody has? I don't see any there. As I'm waiting just to see if we get any others, I'm going to share my screen here, Keith. I'm curious if you have ever seen this, or if anybody who is from the Gettysburg area, if you've never visited, I encourage a visit. So in Schuylkill County, in Pottsville, just down the hill from where the Yingling Brewery is the Schuylkill County Civil War Memorial. And on each of the four sides of it, this is a bad picture. The lighting did not cooperate with me when I took this. But on each side is a battle of the Civil War. One says Fort Sumter, one says Gettysburg, I think one says Antietam, and then the fourth one here, it's hard to read, but it says Emancipation. And this is, of course, not a battlefield monument, but goes to that point you mentioned earlier, where how rare it is to see in monumental form any mention of emancipation, though the dedication speeches are filled with it. I'm wondering if you've ever seen this one, or if you've ever seen anything else like this in a town square monument of any sort.
Right. So there's this one I've never seen myself. But I would say that it's an exception that proves the rule, really, in many ways. What it reminds me of, and there's another one that's in Philadelphia that is actually quite prominent. And talk about an exceptional monument. It's a twin monument. There are two towers on either side of a pathway that lead up very close to the Rocky Steps by the museum. Right. And there's these two giant, I believe they're obelisks or some sort of large shafts on either side of a very public walkway. And one of them says Union, and the other one, I believe, says either freedom or I think it says freedom or emancipation. I can't remember what it says exactly. It's escaping right now. But it's very clearly meant to show that it's the end of slavery. And so that, to me, when I saw that, I went, wow, that is really something, because you hardly ever see anything at all like this. There's something that's making a nod, even subtly, to the end of slavery. And this one's explicit, like the one that you just showed, that clearly says emancipation on there. And then, of course, there are monuments like in Emancipation Park, and there's a few other monuments that are pretty important that talk about emancipation. I mean, in the Emancipation Park monument, of course, there's controversy surrounding that because of the position of the enslaved person rising up from slavery, and Lincoln sort of lifting him up, kind of, rubs against the self-emancipation ideas. And so that today is very controversial. And when it went up in the late 19th century, I mean, it's an important statement to make, I think, at that period of time. So there are a few of these around, just like there are a few Confederate monuments around that say something about Anglo-Saxonism on them. There are very few. So the monuments typically don't say those kinds of things. But if you read the monument dedications to Confederate monuments, and I've done the counterpart to the Union ones, is that, you typically, when you look at a Confederate monument, you'll see a soldier or you'll see somebody prominent on their horse, that kind of pretty standard stuff. in cemeteries and in town squares and in front of courthouses and all that kind of thing. And usually it'll say something along, very lost cause ideas like, for what we thought was right and that kind of stuff. But very rarely do you see anything about race on those and white supremacy or slavery or any of that kind of thing. But if you read the speeches, they talk about it all the time. That's not something that they were keeping from anybody, and they usually frame it in terms of what we call Anglo-Saxonism, the 19th century idea that the Anglo-Saxon people were the superior race and everybody else fell somewhere beneath that, classified somewhere beneath that. Black people, of course, Black African people being, of course, at the bottom of that list. And so they talk about the great Anglo-Saxon people of the Confederacy all the time.
Yep, absolutely. That's an important reminder, everyone, that as Keith mentioned during that, a lot of these are digitized. There are a lot in private archives, but if you Google Pennsylvania Gettysburg, or Pennsylvania Antietam, New York, New Jersey, a lot of these are digitized and are able to be accessed on things like Google Books and Internet Archive. So let's see. Could you, David, just commented? Could you confirm the title of the first book Keith recommended, please?
I think it was Race and Reunion. It's this one by David Blight, I believe is the one I mentioned. Is that the right one?
Yeah, I forget what order they came in. Is that the right one,
yeah.
David?
If not, I think it might have been the first book that I talked about was this. This is the Pennsylvania Commission Report of the Battle of Gettysburg. And this, by the way, is in its entirety on Google Books. If you just type that in, you can download a digital version of it. It'll take up half your hard drive, but you can download a digital version of this, so you don't have to comb antique stores looking for it. As you can see, I've had mine for 20 years, and it was pretty beat up when I got it, and it's deteriorated much for the little pieces of it falling off right now as I speak. It's a well-used book, that one.
For good reason. Well, thank you so much, Keith. Once more, I'll plug Keith's book. It's Across the Bloody Chasm, Culture of Commemoration Among Civil War Veterans, Louisiana State University Press in, 2014. So highly recommend it if you're interested in this topic. He delves into, many of the topics that we looked at this evening as well. Keith, look forward to seeing you personally in a few weeks when you visit Gettysburg. Safe travels, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Cody. I'm looking forward to catching up.
Take care. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a nice evening.
See you, everyone. Bye-bye.